Hello, my name is Elijah Verdell, and today I'm going to be doing my presentation on antitrust. So what is antitrust? The textbook defines antitrust as laws protecting commerce from unlawful restraints and anti-competitive practices. In other words, antitrust laws protect competition in our economy. Why do we have antitrust? The U.S. operates a mostly free market economy, meaning prices for goods and services are an exchange between consumers and producers with relatively little government interference. There is an idea called the invisible hand, developed by philosopher Adam Smith, that states, through individual self-interest and freedom of production and consumption, the best interests of society as a whole are fulfilled. In other words, if the market is allowed to dictate itself, it will become balanced, resulting in an improved society. This would be true in an ideal society, but realistically, people are greedy. Many people are driven purely by profit and will do whatever it takes to crush their competition. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The Sherman Act regulates all interstate commerce and international business that affects U.S. foreign commerce. There are two major provisions. First is every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy, in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states, or with foreign nations is hereby declared to be illegal. The second, every person who shall monopolize, or attempt to monopolize, or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states, or with foreign nations, shall be deemed guilty of a felony. In the first provision, you can also be convicted of a felony. So, Section 1, it applies to only two or more persons, deals with all forms of anti-competitive practices, namely per se violations and horizontal and vertical restraints. A per se violation is an egregious action that is blatantly anti-competitive and therefore illegal. Horizontal restraint is behavior that restricts competition between firms in the same market, such as price fixing and group boycotts. Vertical restraint is similar to horizontal, however, it involves collusion between firms to halt competition from others. Then Section 2 deals specifically with monopoly and attempts to monopolize. Disruption to competition. You might wonder how a cessation of competition is even possible. Shouldn't someone be able to start a business in the industry, thus creating competition? Unfortunately for anybody wanting to capitalize in the market, these market holders have a trick for dealing with new competitors called predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is the act of pricing a product below the cost to manufacture it in order to drive the competitors out of the market. If it costs $10 to manufacture a teddy bear, and you enter the market expecting to sell teddy bears for $15, if a competitor is selling the bear for $8, you are not going to be able to compete. This only works because monopolies are able to afford taking a loss for the duration that the competitors are in the market. Market power. These firms that seek to get ahead will seize market power. Market power is the ability of a firm to control the market price of its products. When a firm is successful in achieving great market power, it has either become part of a monopoly or an oligopoly. Monopolies and oligopolies. An oligopoly is when a market is controlled by a small number of producers or sellers, effectively eliminating competition from any other firms. Some examples of oligopolies are the mass media, like Disney, Comcast, and Viacom, and big tech, such as Apple's iOS and Google's Android. They don't have any other competition in the smartphone market. There's a few, but none of them are legitimate. On the contrary, when an entire market is controlled by only one producer or seller, they have a monopoly. Technically, monopolies shouldn't exist. However, there are some exceptions, such as PG&E, who controls almost the entire electricity market of the Central Coast. And there are two types of monopolies. There are natural monopolies, which are created through a natural market process in which one firm has a large advantage over the others without explicitly engaging in anti-competitive behavior. Typically, these are the first firms in a market, And an example of this is, once again, PG&E. And then there are unnatural monopolies, which are artificially created through anti-competitive behavior. Unnatural monopolies are much more common, and in order to expose a monopoly, one must show proof of anti-competitive conduct and an intent to stifle competition. So now we're going to be getting into the inception of antitrust. Can't talk about antitrust without talking about Rockefeller. By far the most famous case of monopoly and the reason that antitrust exists. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company was a backbone of America during the late 1800s. It was discovered that you could drill into the ground for oil in 1859, and Rockefeller, being an already successful banker, was able to capitalize on this. His rise was so successful due to the importance of railroads at the time, coupled with the increasing popularity and availability of automobiles. His company developed many innovative technologies that improved the oil refining process and gave him an edge in the market. At his peak, it is estimated that he controlled 90% of all oil in the country. It is also estimated that he is the richest American in history, whose net worth adjusted for modern times is over $418 billion. So he was an economic titan who took market control through a carefully executed scheme that was meant to bring order to the oil market, in his own words. He engaged in many now illegal practices, such as predatory pricing, in which he would cut the price of oil so that consumers would only buy from him. Then he would buy out the competing firms after they failed to produce a profit. These acts, coupled with the technological advancements, allowed him to seize full market control and thus establish a monopoly. In 1890, the U.S. government enacted the Sherman Antitrust Act, which allowed the courts to go after Standard Oil. And here I have a video that goes more in depth into how he formed his monopoly.
Something happened that would change his life forever. Just 100 miles east of Cleveland, the first American oil well had been discovered. This marked the beginning of the Pennsylvania oil rush, and within a year, 4,500 barrels of oil would be produced. Now, back then oil wasn't quite as valuable as it is today. Gasoline cars hadn't been invented yet, but oil could still be processed into kerosene, which people would then use in lamps. John realized, however, that the biggest profits to be had weren't in drilling for oil, but in refining it. He witnessed many people going bust before striking oil, so he knew that the business was too risky for him. Instead, he'd let others go through the hassle of finding the oil, and he would just buy it off of them. John had to wait until 1863 for the government to build a rail line connecting the Pennsylvania oil fields to Cleveland. But when that line was built, John was ready for it, with a long line of partners and banks ready to back him up. He also assembled a team of seasoned chemists and engineers, who not only optimized the refining process, but also discovered various uses for the byproducts of refining petroleum. You see, the early refineries in Cleveland could only operate at about a 60% efficiency, but John not only increased that percentage, he also started selling all the byproducts, like paraffin wax, tar, and naphtha. Within 2 years, the Rockefeller refinery was worth over $70,000 and was among the largest in Cleveland. But John wasn't done. In 1865, there were 26 competing refineries, but within 5 years, John had acquired all but 4 of them. By this point, his business was getting too big to handle as a partnership, so in 1870 he incorporated as Standard Oil of Ohio. To convince the few remaining competitors in Cleveland, John would simply invite them over and show them his books, revealing that he could operate at a loss far longer than they could stay solvent. In exchange for a good buyout price, John would offer his competitors positions in his own company, thus placing the brightest minds in the industry under his control. Of course, not everyone would give up immediately, and over time, John eroded the price of oil and kerosene, sometimes by as much as 80%, in order to strangle competitors. Unsurprisingly, his strategy worked. By 1880, he had acquired refineries across the northeastern US and was refining over 90% of the entire country's oil production. At this point, John was so powerful that he could invite the owners of the big rail companies and personally negotiate rebates for using their trains. But this practice of negotiating backroom deals really got the business world riled up. At the time, and still kind of today, most industrial goods were transported by rail, and many big industrialists got worried that John's abuse of transportation rebates could result in similar monopolization in their industries. Over the next decade, businessmen, politicians, and the media would attack Standard Oil with increasing ferocity. Legislators in Ohio began drafting antitrust regulations to bring down Rockefeller, but he was one step ahead. In 1882, he reincorporated in New Jersey, this time creating the Standard Oil Trust, which in turn held stakes in over 40 local companies. Then, to showcase his success, John built an impressive headquarters for his company on Broadway. This moment was the high point of Rockefeller's Standard Oil. He owned 20,000 oil wells, 4,000 miles of pipeline, and employed over 100,000 people. But his grip on the oil industry was loosening, both domestically and abroad. Massive oil deposits had been discovered in Russia and in Asia, and were being developed by the Rothschild family, which spared no effort in getting that oil to America. Worse yet, in 1890, the federal government passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which officially gave politicians the teeth to go after the Standard Oil Trust itself. Of course, the complex legal structure behind all the companies was very difficult to investigate, which is why the government couldn't actually break up Standard Oil until 1911. By that point, however, John Rockefeller had already cashed in and was no longer actively managing the company. In the final 20 years of his company's existence, it had paid out over $500 million in dividends. By some estimates, the true worth of Standard Oil at its peak was $1 trillion, so the breakup didn't really come as a surprise to most people. In 1911, the Supreme Court found Standard Oil guilty of anti-competitive practices and broke the company up into 34 separate entities. Of course, John Rockefeller kept his stake in those companies until his death, and in fact it turns out that the breakup was the most profitable event in his life. You see, over time, many of those companies merged back with one another. Today, most of the Standard remnants are part of either ExxonMobil, Chevron, or BP, which have since become incredibly large companies in their own right. John Rockefeller's ownership of these successor companies made him the richest businessman to have ever lived, with an estimated net worth of $400 billion. Even today, no one has beaten Rockefeller in the leaderboard. Not even Jeff Bezos himself seems like.
So clearly, Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company was a huge deal at the time, and one of a few reasons that we have the antitrust that we do today. But now we're going to jump into some modern antitrust. So it all starts with the Clayton Act. In the modern day, it is much harder to create a monopoly from the ground up. It is easier to start firms in virtually every industry, and competition between firms is much more aggressive. Mergers and acquisitions are how modern-day monopolies are formed. The Clayton Act, established in 1914, sought to combat this. It states that a person or business organization cannot hold stock or assets in another entity where the effect may be to substantially lessen competition. It also makes illegal horizontal mergers between two entities in a single market, if it significantly increases market concentration. The three factors considered in legality of horizontal mergers are overall concentration of relevant product market, relevant market's history of tending towards concentration, and whether the merger is designed to establish market power or restrict competition. The first case we'll be talking about is Anheuser-Busch InBev and Saab Miller. Anheuser-Busch is known for brands such as Budweiser, Stella, and Busch, while Saab Miller has more of an international presence and is known for companies like Miller, Peroni, and Pilsner. Anheuser-Busch InBev and Saab Miller are the two largest beer manufacturers in the world. In 2016, the Department of Justice approved a $109 billion horizontal merger between the two beer giants. This was very contentious at the time and made many small breweries fearful that their distribution will be stifled. However, the Department of Justice has established many restrictions and conditions on the merger in order to prevent this from happening. For example, ABI will have to discontinue its controversial incentive programs that reward its independent distributors for limiting sales of their high-end craft and import beers. This merger gave the companies control of roughly 29% of the entire world's beer supply. The The next giant merger was Time Warner and AT&T. In 2016, the largest telecom company in the world, AT&T, makes a bid of $85 billion to buy Time Warner. Time Warner is a media company that owns Warner Bros., HBO, CNN, and many other large media companies. Presidential candidate Donald Trump denounced the move, stating it would put too much concentration of power in the hands of too few. After he was elected president, the DOJ filed a lawsuit against AT&T, citing the same reasons, marking the first time in multiple decades that the U.S. government had intervened in a merger. In June of 2018, the judge ruled in favor of AT&T and was given the go-ahead to complete the merger. However, in August, the DOJ filed an appeal, which put the company up before a panel of judges in Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals. Once again, the judges sided with AT&T. Why did the DOJ care? This merger was the largest telecom company in the world, acquiring one of the largest media companies in the world. There are obvious implications of the two titans combining, such as the suppression of competition that could result. Arguably more important than that was the precedent set. From 2010 to 2016, the number of approval requests for mergers passed to the federal government increased 58%. This case opened the door for titans of one industry to acquire titans in others, which can be a dangerous path when trying to protect competition. So now we're going to talk about current legislation regarding antitrust. In February, a new bill was proposed named the Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act. The bill is meant to amend the Clayton Act to make anti-competitive mergers more difficult. According to the Regulatory Review, proponents of the Reform Act argue that because judicial decisions and federal enforcement policies have weakened the Clayton Act over time, it should be altered to enable regulators to prohibit mergers that would have potential anti-competitive effects, such as reduced choice, reduced innovation, the exclusion of competitors, or increased entry barriers for smaller companies. The bill would raise maximum civil fines under the Sherman Act and Clayton Act to either 15% of a company's U.S. revenues from the prior year or 30% of a company's revenues stemming from the unlawful conduct. So some final notes. In conclusion, antitrust is a cornerstone of the American market system. It has been shown throughout history that without antitrust laws, anti-competitive behavior will increase and systems that are detrimental to the consumer will thrive. The government has become more relaxed on enforcing both the Sherman and Clayton Act. However, there is current legislation that aims to bolster these defenses. Thank you.